You trace this fear of Islam back to early Christian writings that framed Islam as a heresy, or these ancient narratives traveling through history and shaping up this modern Christian attitude here in the United States. So I wanted you to just share some thoughts on this concept of the holy envy and how it can make the other better.
Sure. Holy envy is this idea, of course, that you see something in another religion that you wish were incorporated in your own practice. I think that for the next crisis that we have to build these relationships right now so that we can respond in a really adequate way.
You're listening to Wise Women with Daisy Khan, where faith rolls up its sleeves as a force for good and where women define the future with wisdom and wonder. I'm Daisy Khan. Kindly subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Islamophobia in the church is often unspoken but deeply rooted, and in this episode, I will be joined by the authors of Confronting Islamophobia in the Church to explore how history, theology, and everyday assumptions shape the Christian view of Islam, and also what we can do to change that. I'm here joined by Reverend Anna Piela and Michael Woolf, a Reverend, who co-founded Challenging Islamophobia Together, Chicagoland. It's an interfaith solidarity initiative dedicating to confronting anti-Muslim hate. They are ordained American Baptist pastors, deeply rooted in the Christian tradition, yet they believe learning from other religions enriches and deepens their own faith. So together they bring faith to life through public witness and interreligious collaboration. Welcome to both of you to Wise Women.
Thank you for having us.
It's an honor.
I'm very excited for the two of you to be here because like myself, you've been doing this interreligious work for so long. Since you've been doing it for so long, was there a moment in your life where both of you felt and it clicked that you needed to do something about Islamophobia so much so that you actually wrote the book?
Yeah, there was a specific moment, and that was May 2024, when we organized an event. It was a memorial for a little boy who was murdered here in October 2023 in Chicagoland. And we felt that the response to that tragedy was very lukewarm in the Christian communities. And that's why we wanted to honor Wadi, and we also wanted to support what is now known as the Wadi resolution in Congress, which is a resolution against Islamophobia, anti-Palestinian hate, and anti-Semitism. And so that's when we organized an interfaith event. We had a congressperson, Representative Dalia Ramirez. That's when it clicked for us that this is not just one event, this has to be ongoing work. And so we're here. And
the churches are so important because they can mobilize so many people. Reverend Michael, anything from you?
Part of the problem is that we had trouble convincing Christians, I think, that they ought to care about this issue. And these are progressive Christians. These are, I guess, it's a wider spectrum than that, but these are folks you would think would care about it. So we understood, and we've been involved in interfaith dialogue for a long time, but we thought we've really got to figure out some way to bring Christians into dialogue with Muslims and to be able to regrow some of those institutions, because after October 7th, we really saw a lot of Christians taking steps back from the Muslim community. Partnerships that had been there for decades were all of a sudden not really being pursued. And so we started to hear from a lot of our Muslim partners, what's the point of engaging in all this interfaith dialogue if when the going gets tough, they abandon us?
Yeah.
And so we really felt that. And we really knew that, I think that for the next crisis, that we have to build these relationships right now so that we can respond in a really adequate way.
But since you talked about people getting abandoned, I want to trace back to, in your book, how you trace this fear of Islam back to early Christian writings that framed Islam as a heresy. I mean, how are these ancient narratives traveling through history and shaping up this modern Christian attitude here in the United States?
These narratives, these tropes are over 1,000 years old. And I could give you a few names, important points that kind of just are prominent in this history. But one thing I want to emphasize is that the longevity of those tropes is incredible. What we heard 1,000 years ago, or what Christians heard 1,000 years ago, Christians are hearing now. And we can start off with the first recorded work, which was a refutation of Islam. It was written by John of Damascus, who was a Syrian monk, and he described Islam as a type of Christian heresy. So not a faith tradition in its own right, but some sort of weird split off, weird new branch that is just going in the wrong direction.
Right.
And he started this, and there were a lot of monks, and usually it was in the monastic situations that these treatises were penned. At one point, Christians felt that they needed to know more about the Quran. And Peter the Venerable, who was the abbot of the Benedictine order in Cluny, he commissioned a translation of the Quran. He commissioned it to Robert Ketton, who was an English priest and diplomat. And so something was produced, but I would not call it a translation. It was mostly a paraphrase of the Quran with some additions. And of course, the point, the motivation for creating such a work was to refute Islam. And so they created this strong person to refute that it would not be recognized by Muslims of the time if it was translated back into Arabic. That's striking. And that translation really shaped the views of Christians about Islam for centuries to come. Then it was reinforced by the first printing of that translation, which was actually prefaced by Martin Luther. And again, the motivation for the printing was to give this sort of platform from which Christians could refute Islam. And in the printed volume, Christians' commentary on the Quranic verses or passages that were translated, that the Christian commentary was printed side by side. So the response, the refutation was presented right there. And at one point, of course, the perception of Islam changed from it being a heresy, and it just started being painted as an existential threat. And really, that was necessary. It was a justification for the Crusades. And so what was originally known as the Promised Land, the land of Palestine at the time, then it was renamed as the Holy Land, because then the Christians of the time felt that they could articulate a stake in that territory, and that now they had some right to take it back, to own it. And that was sanctioned by the Pope of the time, Urban II. He gave a speech in which he said, these people are of the accursed race, and you have the right to own that land. And so the church actively participated in recycling and reinforcing those tropes, but they were necessary. They were a means to an end, and the end was military victory and capture of lands. So if you look at the Crusades of today, American incursion into Iraq and Afghanistan, the same tropes have been used to justify it. It is just incredible. If you look at what American politicians say, some conservative Republican politicians will say horrible things, but I see those news articles and I think this is the same thing that people were saying 1,000 years ago. It is just must be useful. It must bring political capital. It must have some advantages to those who say that.
Reverend Michael, Christians only, because Muslims are such a small percentage of the population here, Christians only encounter Muslims as usually the distant other, right? So we're out there somewhere, maybe somebody knows a neighbor. But what shared values do you think can help them see Islam as a pure faith rather than as the threat community that Reverend Anna just mentioned?
Sure. And so what we spend some time sort of articulating in the book is that there's differences, right? But this focus on prayer focuses on spiritual disciplines like fasting, a real concern for the ordering of society, how society ought to be ordered. Islam surpasses Christianity in its concern about that and is far more practical in that regard. And it has some really interesting things to say about justice. And so I think that for Christians who are trying to think about what should our society be ordered, conversation with Islam and with Quran and Hadith is really important because there's a lot there to offer. Those sorts of values that we see across our different holy books ought to be a pathway into collaboration. And in some way, of course, for Christians, it's important if they don't know that Isa and Jesus is a prophet in Islam, it's very important for them to understand how much veneration he receives and how important he is, and his role in sort of the eschatology and the last days and all that sort of stuff is really important. I think that while the Muslim Jesus and the Christian Jesus are obviously different in some ways, I think that's also a portal way in for people to understand that the Quran has been in dialogue with not just Christian, but Jewish texts for a long time. And from its inception, it's always been in dialogue. It's always been part of that dialogue. And really, it's an invitation for Christians to join in a process that's already been going on and to make friends in that regard, because it's so important that Christians come to see Islam as a pure tradition with nuance and interesting things to say about God that can help them also think about similar things.
In your book, you draw upon Krista Stendhal's famous rules of interfaith understanding, which I love. I think everybody should read your book to understand what that is. But he also has this idea of the holy envy. And I did not know what this term was, but I want to share a story with you where I actually experienced it many years ago when I first started fasting. When my devout Catholic secretary heard that I was fasting every day for a month, not drinking water, coffee, or eating food, she just blurted out in front of the hundreds of people that were there assembled around me. She said, "Shame on me. I'm a Catholic and I don't even fast during Lent. I only give up chocolate. Shame on you. And you, a Muslim, do not eat or drink from dawn to sunset for 30 days straight? Wow, shame on me." At that point, I had no idea what that was, but to me, that was a definition of holy envy. And I know so many people that are now fasting along with Muslims, saying, why don't we live up to our high standards? So I wanted you to just share some thoughts on this concept of the holy envy and how it can make the other better.
Sure. Holy envy is this idea, of course, that you see something in another religion that you wish were incorporated in your own practice. And you see something that's admirable that you want to bring into being and that you wish was there. And one of the things that I think of when I think about this is prayer. The Christian tradition has a pretty venerable tradition of scheduled prayer, but that's not exactly something that I follow. But through engagement with my Muslim friends, I think that I really see the benefit of having a schedule to pray. And also I approach prayer a little different. When I think about prayer now, I am doing a little bit less waiting for God to speak into my life and solve things, and a little bit more offering up the parts of myself, and a little bit more just trying to say, here's this relationship that I'm speaking out, but I don't necessarily have to spend all this time worrying about if God is going to speak directly back to me, which is an anxiety point, I think, for a lot of Christians. A lot of Christians do that prayer, and they don't hear God's voice speaking in their ear, and they wonder what's wrong with me, because some people seem to report that. So
prayer, fasting, charity, and then also serving others, poverty alleviation. These are all very important points of collaboration and points that overlap. But Reverend Anna, I want to go to this fascinating survey that you did with the Baptist community, and you have the findings of that in your book. What surprised you the most, and in terms of overlaps? And then the second point, which of course you and I are both passionate about, why do you think that perceptions of Muslim women in particular were so negative in this survey?
I wouldn't say I was very surprised by the results. For one thing, our results were quite similar in terms of those theological overlaps to a survey that was done 10 years earlier by Episcopalians, who basically studied a sample of their alumni and knew what to expect. The ethical framework and the moral perception of the world. I think that's where our American Baptist clergy thought that Christianity and Islam were the closest. I think that's pretty good. Our respondents realized that Muslims have a moral framework for the world, which is centered around the divine. And the theological concept on which our American Baptist respondents thought there was the least overlap was, of course, the role of women in the faith and in the world. It didn't actually say what they thought that role was, but we can only assume that, in their view, women had a much higher, much better position in the faith and in the world than in Islam. And this is a articulation or manifestation of what I call soft Islamophobia, which is, I would say, probably quite prevalent among progressives in general. These people will not engage in hate crimes or hate speech as such, but are practices that prop up Islamophobia, and that's the silencing of Muslim partners in gatherings, but also a sort of patronizing view of the Muslim community, and specifically in terms of women and women's role And before I came to ministry, I have been a scholar, and my topic was Islamic feminism. And so for me, confronting that stereotype of Muslim women as in some way without agency, I've witnessed that in scholarly circles for decades, really. And so when I came to ministry and I met regular people, including clergy, I was really surprised that this stereotype is still so strong. As a scholar, before I came to ministry, I specialized in Islamic feminism. I did research projects that specifically looked and honored Muslim women's agency in what they do. And coming out of the non-scholarly, non-academic world, I was very surprised how strong the stereotype of Muslim women as non-agentic, as silenced, as suppressed is, not just among regular people, but also among clergy, which to me just shows that they must not have any kind of real partnerships with Muslim communities, and they must not know actual Muslim women, because if they did, they would know that Muslim women are among the most driven and outspoken people here in the United States. I hear Muslim women's voices all the time, and I don't know how others don't. It's just, I suppose, you hear many things, but you listen to only select few things, and maybe that's not what they're listening to.
That's why I'm doing this podcast, is to clarify that, because if only they read the Quran, they would know the rights that Muslim women have. I did a podcast on 10 rights of Muslim women that you do not know about, that are grounded in scripture. These are not rights that were given to us by the state or by progressives. These are rights that are divinely granted rights. They don't read the Quran. B, they probably don't know a Muslim woman. And then all they get is their news from the media, with women clad in burqas and silenced by Taliban. And that's what they think it is, right?
Yeah, just to add one thing, one of the projects I did was about the burqa, or the experience of wearing the niqab in the West. And I spoke to 40 women who wear it, and they were eloquent, they were really well educated, and it was a choice for them. And I just really admired how they had the strength of mind, strength of their soul to do something that they knew that they would be socially penalized. What I'm trying to say is, wearing a burqa or niqab doesn't mean that you're going to be suppressed or without agency.
Reverend Michael, you also mentioned in the book that Christians actually want to understand Muslims, but they simply lack accurate information and a clear way forward. What is your recommendation? Do you believe that's the case for most majority of Christians, or just the ones that you've interacted with?
Yeah, so I think that people want to understand Muslims. I think that is definitely the case. Some people think that they understand Muslims, but they don't, because a lot of the teaching that goes on in congregations can be quite adversarial and combative and Islamophobic. One of the things that we can take away from this, though, is that congregations, churches, are places where people learn about other religions. And so if they are learning about other religions poorly, perhaps they could learn about other religions in a better way, in a way that helps people come into authentic relationship. And so I think there is the desire for understanding more, but they don't know where to start. And one of the things that I recommend is trying to form actual relationships with people. Our book is a great place to start if you want to start textually, if you want to begin to try to understand this historical dialogue and bring it into the present. There's a lectionary commentary where you got Bible readings that are assigned that week, and then you've got Quran and Hadith, and they can be in conversation with one another. But there's really no replication, and there's no substitution for coming into authentic relationship with people who are of a different religion. And one of the things that's coming up, of course, is Ramadan, and there's opportunities for interfaith iftars and for people to form those relationships. So it's actually a really amazing time to begin that journey. And that there's been a lot of bad information out there, and the book, of course, tries to correct that information, but also we're hoping that it leads people into these opportunities to form relationships and be able to really bridge that gap between religions.
So if I could just drill down a little bit, is there one thing that you think you've heard consistently that seems to be the one constant misinformed notion of Islam that Christian communities have that Muslims could focus on clarifying, or your book has clarified?
I'm not sure that there's one. I'd say maybe there's like a matrix of three that come up. One is that Islam is somehow a violent faith, or there's violence inherent in the practice of Islam. Another is one that we just talked about, that's a subjugation of women. And the third is that it's incompatible with Western democracy. These are the three things that we probably hear the most when we have conversations with Christians. Some of these are placed in theological sort of arguments, and some of these are more secular. And I think they're blending the two. We live in an age of white Christian nationalism, so it shouldn't surprise people that theology and politics are merging in these theocratic and really harmful ways. But those are the three things that I think we encounter, and the book does a pretty good job of dismantling those and helping people understand that, again, this tradition has a lot of really interesting and great things to say about God and human beings and our role on the earth. And if we could really pick it up and wrestle with it, we would be better Christians. And I think that's the conversation is so important for Christians to understand. It's not just that you should do it because you want to be a good guy or you want to be nice or something like that from a point of benevolence. You ought to do it because it's going to help you grow your faith in some way too. Max Muller has this great quote. It was in the 19th century conversation about religion. And he says, the person that knows one religion knows none. And I think that's true. In comparison, we're able to actually understand more about ourselves and about our own religion and about others too. Everybody wins in that dialogue.
And Reverend Anna, I remember when I started doing interfaith dialogue, there were even some Muslims that would say, why are you doing that? Because it's like going to dilute your faith. I think that the people are afraid to even enter into this conversation because somehow they feel that their faith is going to be challenged, or by understanding another faith, instead of it enriching you, it's somehow going to dilute your faith. Is that true also in the Christian community?
Yes, we've heard that a lot. We've seen that in our survey. And to that, we have one response, which is actually engaging at a theological and social level with another faith is going to make you a better Christian. And that might sound a little counterintuitive, but the example that we usually give is the Trinity, and how a lot of clergy, upon graduation, exiting the seminary, struggle with articulating what the Trinity is. They just wave it off as a mystery or use kind of insider speak to talk about it. But if they were to explain it to someone who's not within the tradition, they would struggle. So engaging with the medieval Muslim Islamic critics of the Trinity can actually give a Christian a much better understanding what their faith is and how to respond to those charges. I'm not saying to only engage with the criticisms, but it is possible to understand your faith by looking at another faith and seeing yours through that prism, if that makes sense. We are not about conversion, far from it. If, as a result of our book, people started converting to Islam, we would probably think we failed, because this is not about conversion. This is about the possibility of a real, genuine dialogue between faith traditions and believers of those traditions, in what I think the Pluralism Project at Harvard called it engagement across the deep difference. So this is it's not a new idea. It's just a new iteration of that idea, where you don't have to put your faith aside to be able to have an interaction with a person of another faith, but actually to grow your own faith through it. So yeah, we invite people to try that. It worked for us.
I think most people who are novices at dialogue walk in there and saying, I'm going to convince this person of my point of view, or I'm going to convert them to my point of view. And that's the attitude that they come with. And then they realize the other person has something incredible to offer to their own understanding of that particular topic and that subject. And then they feel, okay, I can absorb that. I think I can absorb that. And it's a process, right? It's a process where you have to go through this understanding and deepen your understanding and not see the other one as a threat, but to really see this as like common ancestors of the faith.
Totally. Yeah, I think that's right. And I think it also, one of the things that both of our traditions would commend to us is humility. And I think that having a little bit of humility when you go into a place, not that you have all the answers, but that you're on this journey and you're on a path together and you can learn from each other, even if it's different paths. I think that's really good. And whenever we can, I think in our society, learn a little bit about humility is a really good thing.
God is not just owned by one group of people. We don't own God. God owns all of us, sort of. That shift in attitude, right? Understanding that we're all children of God and we've all been created for a purpose. And how do we then interact with one another to become as godlikely as we possibly can on this earth, right? A reflection of that.
And it is quite fascinating if you look into the history of interreligious exchange. is that Islamic medieval theologians discovered or they formulated those ideas really early Middle Ages, 800s, when they started talking about other religions in the sense of here's a neutral description. We're not talking about those other faiths as errors, but here it is this faith and it has some good things in it. And Al-Biruni, the father of anthropology and comparative religion, he was a shining example of that. In the Christian world, there was one example, Nicholas of Cusa in the 16th century. He didn't go as far as the Islamic theologians, but there was like one little glimmer of that sort of idea. And then really it started off from the Christian side in the 20th century. So that's something to be impressed with.
And going to today's time where we have all this knowledge that we can even interact with fellow Christians, that they can interact with Muslims, and you have plethora of books that have been written on these topics. How these books have been written on these topics. How can pastors and church leaders challenge Islamophobia in their sermons, their teachings, and everyday Christian language? What do they need to do?
Yeah, the best thing that they can do, either a pulpit or Bible study or wherever they're talking to folks, pastors have such an influence on how their congregants are going to perceive another religion. They need to take that seriously. And I think that it's just straight talk, right? The more we can take on these really damaging tropes and unpack them for people, the better we're going to be. And pastors operate in this interesting realm. They're highly trusted and highly respected people for their congregants. They're more trustworthy than the right-wing influencer on TikTok who's trying to push in the other direction. They're more trustworthy than cable news, which, as we know, is not necessarily an ally in this fight all the time. Taking this sort of challenge head on and really wrestling with those tropes and unpacking them in sermons is really powerful. The other thing that they can do is to place these venerable traditions in dialogue with one another scripturally and see what comes out. I think the more that Christians don't think about Islam as a dangerous political ideology, and the more they see it as a pure tradition with something fascinating to say about God, that folks are going to be able to help make the world better.
At the individual level, if I'm a Muslim and I want to reach Christians and I want to build their literacy because it's my obligation to do that, what is the best suggestion you have for Muslims to push back against this misinformation within the Christian communities and in the social circles that they hang out with? What should we do? Obviously, social media is just one aspect, but what do you think it would give us the best results?
I think being open to those interfaith partnerships. So, for example, a congregation gets a chance to interact with a real Muslim. One thing we did at our church is the initiative we call Reading the Quran. We started it in response to an incident where a political candidate in Texas burned the Quran or a copy of the Quran with a flamethrower. And she also said that she was powered by Jesus Christ. And so for us, it was anathema. And our motto was, don't burn the Quran, read it. We brought our Muslim friends, Muslim partners here in Chicagoland to come to our church and to read the Quran, to recite it in Arabic, to read the translation in English, and then just engage with the congregation, answer their questions. And people loved it. People in our congregation were excited that they had a chance to ask questions that they appeared to have had for a long time, but they just didn't know where to find answers. And if anybody has a chance to connect with the congregation at that level, through interfaith associations, relationships with clergy, then it's super helpful.
That would be so great. From my experience of having done interfaith dialogues literally since 9/11, it's sitting across tables, breaking bread, having conversations around one particular topic, and just getting to know one another, trust building, and then that relationship then becomes all embracing. And I remember that when I was attacked for proposing a community center, all of these communities that we had interacted with circled the wagons around us and literally were our allies because they had built trust with us. They knew that we were fellow co-religionists, and you attack me, you attack me, my brother and sister. That was the level, but that couldn't have happened without getting to know one another.
And that's why it's so important to do it right now for whatever sort of crises that we're going to face in the future. And we seem to have roiling crises in this country. The more that we are able to build those partnerships now for whatever crisis is going to come up in the future, the better position we'll be.
Exactly. With all AI and everything that's coming, people of faith need to come together as allies in whatever challenges we're going to face in the future. So you also have some very specific suggestions, like 10 steps to doing this. Could you go through some of those and what kind of transformation you would see if Christian communities actually took those steps, and what would we see in the broader society. I'll start with Reverend Anna first and then go to Michael as well.
I think our first suggestion is to eat together. And like Michael said, an opportunity for that is coming up. Ramadan is starting in less than 3 weeks. And so those interfaith iftars are a chance to not just have a conversation, but actually eat together. And I think this is like a deeply social act that creates bonds between people. You're not going to eat together at the same table with someone you don't like. Generally, so that the fact that you're eating together is starting point. For me personally, what is really important is that people who are trying to make those connections and relationships remember that there are various Muslim communities around. It's not just one Islam, and it's not, or rather, there is one Islam, but there are people who understand and practice it in slightly different ways. And we've got Sunni Muslims who are the majority in the Muslim world and also here in the West. But we also have Shias, we have Sufis. There are various communities, and when there's a panel or when there's a conversation or some sort of event, reach out to various groups. Have people from different branches of Islam, have men, have women, just so you have all different perspectives, not just one perspective that can create a really wrong perception that this person is a Muslim, therefore whatever they say must be Muslim and Islamic. I like to introduce the idea of interpretive diversity in Islam to people, and people are generally surprised when they hear about that.
Which is surprising. As Christians, we're very accustomed to that idea. If you go to the Episcopal Church or you go to Baptist Church, you expect there to be some diversity of opinion or different ways of engaging with that text or living it out. But it's about pure tradition, understanding it in a multidimensional way. One of the things that I often talk about with folks and that I really spend a lot of time is that you have to be as generous a reader of the Quran as you are of the Bible. So a lot of people who are Christians practice the hermeneutics of generosity towards their own text, and in which they're really willing to say, oh, this verse about this, we can interpret this away into something that I like, all these sorts of things. But there are passages that approve of slavery in the Bible, quite a few. And those have to be wrestled with. But as Christians, we're comfortable with saying, let's put it in context and explain.
And there's one verse from the Bible that says that there's no slave or no free. And there's one verse that is always wheeled out to say Christianity is against slavery. But that's a very generous reading of the Bible.
Yes, and so what I'm trying to have people do is be just as generous readers of the Quran. And so that's a hard step for people, because I think if they understand the engagement between two religions as adversarial, which one religion has to come out on top, then you're going to try to read a holy book in Scripture in an adversarial way. But instead, you're being invited to actually be a generous reader, and that can be very transformative for people. It's all about our dispositions and what we're bringing to the table, and when we engage with these texts and with these people.
And also, people don't realize that you don't have to read all of our scriptures literally. Context is important, whether it's metaphorical, whether it is literal. What is the verse trying to say? People think that somehow you just take the verse out of context and cherry pick it, and that's the verse and it's locked. And also they're reading in English, not understanding that there are like 40 translations of it that vary. So from translation to translation. Reverend Michael, if the information that you have in your book is actually used by people, what transformation would you like to see in the Christian communities? And what would that do to our broader community?
Yeah, I think that having more interfaith partnerships between churches and mosques and between individual Christians and Muslims, I think that could change the world in small ways and big ways, right? I think that when we have interfaith partners actually working together to solve local issues, then we can build up from that and maybe take on the sort of crises that we have in our country right now. I think that we have these interfaith networks, but we need so many more people than the people who are just doing interfaith dialogue. In Chicagoland, we're known people and we see a lot of the same people over and over again. What we need is so many more people to really bring their time, their wisdom to bear on this issue. And if we do, we can solve local problems. I believe that we can solve things like homelessness. I think that we can improve our schools. We can do these sort of local tasks that seem really important because we have shared values. And we can speak up on issues around justice because we have these shared values. And I think that for Christians, that would look like having just more conversations, but also in church being able to situate Islam as that sort of peer tradition. And I think that's going to build respect, and I think that could, like I said, change the world just a little bit.
Reverend Anna, would you like to say something before we conclude?
I was just thinking about a specific example of what Michael said in broader terms. I recently spoke with the director of Interfaith Children's Movement. It's a nonprofit in Georgia. And this is where different faith groups come together to do local projects and advocacy for children. And Georgia was apparently 49th in terms of children's welfare when they started. And now they moved by 10 or 15 places in the sort of national ranking. And they see this as a success. They were able to advocate on behalf of all children. And this is what I really like.
Great. All of you listening, I hope today's conversation sparks something in you, whether it's curiosity or even a little holy envy. I do encourage you to pick up Confronting Islamophobia in the Church. Is it available on Amazon and bookstores everywhere?
Yep. It's out as of this week.
Okay, great. Okay, so congratulations. I went through the book. I loved it. It's a vital guide to anyone looking to bridge divides with wisdom and with deep compassion. I thank you both for joining me today. Thank you for joining me on Wise Women. If something stirred in you today, don't let it stop here. Share this episode with someone who needs it. Reflect on what resonated for you. And definitely plant one seed of change, however small. Remember, you do matter, and your actions have a ripple effect. But none of us can rise alone. To explore more resources and ways to get involved, do visit my website, daisycon.com. And don't forget to subscribe, rate, and leave a review, because every click is your way of amplifying this message to others. Wisdom isn't just heard, my friends, it's lived. So let's live it. Until next time, stay wise and stay rooted.